What if I told you that the safest place in the world, your home, your family, could also be the most dangerous? What if I told you that the very people who are supposed to protect you can sometimes be the ones who leave the deepest wounds? My name is Evelyn May Whitaker, and I'm 83 years old. I was born in 1942 in a little town called Maple Hollow, tucked deep into the heart of rural Georgia. And today, on this quiet afternoon, sitting on the worn front porch of the only house I've ever truly called mine, I've decided to tell a story I've kept buried for nearly 70 years. It's not a story I enjoy telling. It's not one I ever thought I'd say out loud, much less with people listening. But I know that somewhere out there, another girl is walking through the same fire I once did, thinking she's alone, thinking no one will believe her, thinking silence is her only choice. And for her, I will speak. You see, I was just a little girl the first time I realized something in my family wasn't quite right. I didn't have the words for it back then, didn't understand the full weight of what I was feeling. But deep down, even as a child, I knew love shouldn't feel like fear. I grew up in a small 3-room farmhouse with creaky floors and thin walls where secrets had no place to hide. My daddy, Thomas Whitaker, worked for the county roads department and smelled perpetually of engine oil and cigarettes. He was a loud man, the kind who thought respect was something you earned through fear, and he worshipped my older brother Calvin like he was the second coming of Christ himself. Calvin was 5 years older than me, and from the time we were kids, everyone could see he was the golden boy. Tall, broad-shouldered, with wavy dark hair and green eyes that made the neighbor girls swoon. Daddy always said Calvin was a real man, the kind to carry on the Whitaker name with pride. I was just that girl, a mistake, a burden, a shadow living in Calvin's light. My mama, Lorraine, was a small woman with tired eyes and hands toughened by years of scrubbing laundry on a washboard. She tried, bless her heart, tried to shield me, tried to make up for the love I didn't get from Daddy, tried to keep the peace in a house where peace had to tiptoe. But she was scared of Daddy, of what he'd say, of what he might do. So she smiled through clenched teeth and told me to be a good girl, to stay quiet, to not make trouble. I was 7 when I first noticed Calvin looking at me differently, not the way a brother should look at his little sister. It was subtle at first, long stares, an arm wrapped too tightly around my shoulders, coming into the bathroom without knocking. I didn't understand it. I thought maybe he was being playful, maybe just being a weird older brother, but something in my stomach twisted every time he got too close. One night when I was 9, I was lying in bed in our shared room because our house was too small for separate ones. When I felt him sit on the edge of my mattress, I kept my eyes closed, hoping he'd think I was asleep and go away. But he didn't. He stayed there, silent, for what felt like hours. Then he reached out and brushed my hair away from my face and whispered, "You're real pretty, you know that?" I remember my heart pounding so loud I thought it would wake Mama. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just lay there frozen until he finally stood up and left. That was the first time I felt it, that suffocating mixture of shame and confusion and terror that would follow me for the rest of my life. And it was just the beginning. I tried to tell Mama once. I told her Calvin had been acting strange, that he came into my bed at night sometimes. She paused, dishwater dripping from her hands, and looked at me with that tired face I knew so well. "He's your brother, Evelyn," she said quietly. "He loves you. He's just being protective. You're his little sister. Don't go imagining things." I didn't bring it up again. Daddy, of course, wouldn't have listened. He thought Calvin hung the moon. "That boy's gonna be somebody," he'd say, clapping him on the back. "Not like that girl. Can't even look people in the eye. Always hiding behind skirts." I heard it all. Every insult, every dismissal. I became invisible in my own home. A ghost. Except when Calvin wanted me. He'd wait until everyone was asleep, and then he'd come to my bed. At first he'd just sit there, whisper to me, stroke my arm or my hair. But as I got older, 10, 11, 12, it escalated, always with warnings. "Don't say nothing, or I'll tell Daddy you're sneaking around with boys at school. You know what he'll do to you." And I did. I'd seen him beat my mother for smiling too long at the man who delivered firewood. I'd seen him throw a skillet across the room because the eggs were cold. I didn't doubt for a second what he'd do to me if he thought I brought shame to the family. So I stayed silent. I learned how to cry without making a sound. I learned how to leave my body, to float somewhere else while it all happened. I imagined myself flying far away over the mountains, to a place where no one knew my name or my face. I dreamed of freedom the way some girls dream of weddings. When I turned 13, something shifted. I started getting sick in the mornings. At first I thought it was the flu, but weeks went by and the nausea didn't stop. My appetite vanished. My belly began to swell. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. I was just a child. But deep down, I knew. Mama found out first. She walked in on me changing and saw the tiny bump forming beneath my shirt. Her face went white. "Evelyn May," she said, her voice trembling. "How long?" I couldn't answer. I broke down sobbing. She held me on the floor of our room, rocking me like a baby. "Who did this to you?" she asked. I didn't have to say it. She already knew. We sat there for hours, both of us too broken to move. She wanted to run. "We'll pack a bag," she said. "We'll leave tonight." But when Daddy came home, drunk as ever, we froze. And then Calvin walked through the door, and all the courage we'd gathered evaporated. When Daddy found out, because secrets don't stay buried in small towns, he didn't ask questions. He didn't even look surprised. He just assumed the worst of me, said I'd been sneaking around, called me every name you can imagine. He hit me so hard I saw stars. Mama tried to protect me, but he shoved her out of the way. And Calvin, he stood in the corner and watched. Later that night, after the shouting stopped and the house went quiet, he came to me again. "You're mine," he whispered. "Always have been." I remember the bile rising in my throat. I wanted to die. I truly did. That baby, my baby, was born on a cold night in October, a boy with Calvin's eyes. I never held him. Mama said it was better that way. A distant cousin in another state agreed to take him, raise him as their own. I never saw him again, but I felt him every day, in every corner of that house, in every silent breakfast, in every bruise I hid. He was the shadow of everything I lost. After that, I shut down. I stopped speaking at school, stopped smiling. I became a shell. No one asked questions. In those days, people didn't. The preacher's wife brought us a casserole. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and I kept on breathing because I didn't know what else to do. Years went by. Calvin got a job at the mill. Daddy got older, meaner. Mama faded, and I waited for something, for anything to change. But the silence remained. And now, here I am, decades later, telling a story I swore I'd take to my grave, because silence is what they count on. Silence is what keeps the cycle spinning. If you're still here, listening, would you leave a comment telling me where you're from? I want to know how far my voice can travel. And if you can, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every click, every word of support, it reminds me why I chose to speak. Because someone out there needs to know you are not alone. After my son was taken away, everything around me seemed to freeze, like time had folded itself in shame. But inside, I kept moving, numbly, aimlessly, like a ghost caught between two worlds. I was 14, living in a house where I wasn't a daughter, wasn't a sister, wasn't even a person. I was just a problem no one wanted to see, a burden everyone hoped would disappear. Mama tried, in her own broken way, to comfort me in those first weeks after the birth. She'd bring me tea, sit quietly beside me, sometimes stroke my hair like she did when I was small, but neither of us spoke about him, my baby. It was like he'd never existed. There wasn't a photo, a name, not even a memory allowed in conversation. That silence was a knife, one she and I both held by the blade. Calvin returned to his usual routines, as if nothing had happened. He worked his shifts at the lumber mill, played poker with Daddy on weekends, flirted with the girls at the diner on Sunday afternoons. But when the sun dipped behind the hills and the rest of the world closed its eyes, he still found his way back to my room. The worst part wasn't the pain, though there was plenty of that. The worst part was the numbness, the way I stopped feeling like a person entirely. I had learned how to disappear within myself, to float somewhere far away where I was nobody and nowhere, just empty space. One night, as I lay curled on the edge of my bed pretending to sleep, I realized something chilling. He didn't even care if I cried anymore. I used to hold back my sobs, afraid they'd wake Mama or that he'd punish me harder. But that night I whimpered, loud and broken, and he didn't flinch, didn't pause. He didn't see me as a human. I was furniture. I was his. Mama must have heard. I know she did. The walls were thin, and my cries weren't whispers anymore, but her door stayed closed. Maybe she thought ignoring it was the only way to protect herself. Or maybe she had convinced herself I was safer enduring it than facing what would happen if Daddy found out. Either way, I was alone. I tried returning to school, thinking maybe the routine would help me feel normal, but I couldn't focus. My body ached constantly. and my mind was a battlefield. The other kids looked at me differently now. They whispered. I didn't blame them. I was different. I felt older than my teachers, heavier than the whole world. At 15, I stopped going altogether. Daddy didn't object. No point in schooling a girl who's already ruined, he muttered one night over dinner. Calvin snorted into his mashed potatoes. Mama kept her eyes on her plate, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. It was around this time I started spending hours outside, walking the old trails behind our property, disappearing into the woods where no one could find me. Nature became my only refuge. The rustle of leaves, the quiet songs of birds, even the way the air smelled, like moss and life and something real. It was the only place where I didn't feel watched, judged, or used. Sometimes I imagined running away for good. Just keep walking, I'd tell myself. Keep walking until the world changes. But the truth is, I had nowhere to go, no one waiting to catch me, and so I always returned, just in time for supper. One afternoon in early spring, I was out past the creek when I heard footsteps. My heart dropped. I thought Calvin had followed me, but when I turned, I saw Mrs. Simmons, my old 6th grade teacher, carrying a basket of wildflowers. She smiled gently. Haven't seen you in a while, Evelyn May. I forced a polite nod, tried to keep walking, but she stepped into my path. You look tired, she said, placing a warm hand on my arm. I mean, not just tired. You look like you've been carrying something heavy for too long. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted desperately to say something, anything, to let the truth fall out of my mouth like marbles. But the words got caught, tangled in fear. Instead, I just nodded again and mumbled, just not feeling well lately. She didn't press, just squeezed my hand gently and said, you know where to find me. I didn't go to her. I should have, but I didn't. That summer, things escalated. Calvin started bringing girls home. Not for dating, for show, for Daddy. He'd act like he was a proper gentleman, walking them to the porch, letting them sip sweet tea while Mama pretended to be proud. But late at night, after they were gone, he'd show up at my door again. And that's when I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about control, power. He liked knowing I was there, no matter who else wanted him. He owned me. I stopped eating, lost so much weight my hips jutted out like coat hangers. My hair started falling out in clumps. I was always cold, even in August. Mama took notice, started sneaking me bits of food she'd hidden from Daddy. You gotta eat, baby, she whispered one night. Don't let them break you. But I was already broken. One night when I was 16, I tried to end it. I don't remember the exact moment I decided. I just remember the quietness inside, like the eye of a storm. I walked out to the old shed behind our house, tied a belt from one of Daddy's hunting jackets to the rafter, and stood on a wooden crate. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was calm. I wasn't scared. I was done. But just as I looped the belt around my neck, I heard a noise, someone calling my name. It was Mama. She sounded frantic. I froze. Her voice cracked in that one way I'd never heard before, raw and terrified. I hesitated. That hesitation saved me. I climbed down, collapsed on the floor, and sobbed harder than I had in years. Mama found me minutes later. She didn't ask questions, just held me, kissed my forehead, and rocked me like she used to when I had nightmares. We stayed in that shed for hours. Neither of us said a word. That night she told me something I never forgot. I know I failed you, she whispered. I let fear make me small, but I won't lose you too. Not like this. And for the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Not just regret, but resolve. The next morning, she packed a small bag and told me to wait by the window. When your daddy leaves, we go. I don't care where. We just go. I waited, clutching that bag like it was a lifeline. But when Daddy came home early, angry and reeking of whiskey, everything fell apart. He found the bag, demanded answers. Mama tried to lie, said it was for laundry. He didn't believe her. He slapped her so hard she hit the counter. Then he turned to me. You going somewhere, girl? I didn't answer. I couldn't. He stormed off. Mama whispered that we had to wait, just a little longer. She said she'd find someone to help, someone who wouldn't ask questions. That someone came 2 weeks later in the form of Reverend Paul Avery. I didn't trust him at first. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a softness I wasn't used to in men. Mama told him everything, or enough of it, enough to make him pale. He didn't ask me for details, just said, I believe you, and I want to help. The next day, he brought an old friend of his, Miss Henrietta Caldwell, a retired nurse who lived 3 counties over. She had a small cottage, no family, and a heart bigger than Georgia itself. They offered to take me in, quietly, safely, no questions asked. You'll have your own room, she promised, and no one will ever touch you again. Mama and I cried together that night, This is your chance, she said. Go, live. And so I did. I left Maple Hollow on a Wednesday morning just before sunrise. No goodbye to Daddy, no glance back at Calvin, just a single suitcase and the hope that maybe, just maybe, life could start over. As we pulled away from that house, the first light of day breaking over the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, relief, and underneath that, buried deep where it had waited patiently, a flicker of something even more precious, hope. Starting over sounds simple when you say it out loud, but the truth is, starting over at 16, after everything I'd lived through, didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like being dropped into a world I didn't know how to exist in. I arrived at Miss Henrietta Caldwell's cottage in a daze. She lived in a quiet corner of Pine Haven, a tiny town tucked into the edge of South Carolina, where everybody still waved at strangers and the smell of biscuits lingered on the breeze. Her home was warm and tidy, with curtains that looked handmade and a garden full of vegetables out back. It was the kind of place where you could breathe, or so I imagined. But I didn't breathe, not really, not for a long time. Henrietta gave me the guest room, which had soft yellow wallpaper and a window that looked out over a patch of sunflowers. She didn't ask questions. She didn't press. She just told me, "You can rest here, sugar, as long as you need." I didn't know how to rest. I was terrified of doors opening suddenly. I jumped at the sound of men's voices. I flinched when someone reached toward me, even to hand me a glass of water. At night, I kept the light on and a chair wedged under the doorknob. My mind didn't trust the peace of that house. My body didn't believe I was safe. But Miss Caldwell, Henrietta, she never gave up on me. She left little notes by my plate every morning. "You are seen, you are safe. You are not what they said you are." Man, I didn't respond to them at first. Just read them and tuck them into the drawer beside my bed, like secret prayers. Reverend Avery visited once a week. He never came inside unless I said it was okay. He'd sit out on the porch and talk to Henrietta while I listened through the screen door. Sometimes he'd bring books, sometimes fruit from the church garden. He always left quietly, always with a smile and tell her I'm proud of her no matter what. I started walking in the mornings, just to the edge of the woods and back. At first I couldn't go far. My legs felt too weak and my chest would tighten with every step, like something heavy was still pressing down on me. But day by day, my steps grew steadier. I started noticing things, how the sunlight hit the trees, the sound of birds calling to each other, the way dew sparkled on the grass like tiny stars. For the first time in my life, I felt a whisper of freedom. It was fragile, barely there, but it was mine. A few weeks in, Henrietta asked me if I wanted to try helping in her garden. "No pressure," she said, "but there's healing in putting your hands in the soil. You don't have to talk to it, just let it hold you." So I did. I planted tomatoes and squash, pulled weeds, and let the dirt get under my nails. There was something grounding about it, something honest. Plants didn't ask questions. They just grew, quietly, stubbornly toward the sun. One afternoon while I was gathering cucumbers, Henrietta came up beside me and said softly, "You know, Evelyn, you don't have to be brave all the time. It's okay to cry. It's okay to fall apart." I didn't say anything, but that night, I finally opened the drawer beside my bed, pulled out all the notes she'd left me, and laid them on the quilt one by one. I read each one aloud. My voice cracked, my hands shook, and then I cried. Loud, ugly, body-racking sobs. The kind of cry I hadn't allowed myself in years. She didn't come in. She didn't need to. I knew she heard me, and I knew she understood. That cry was the beginning of something. The next morning, I asked if I could help her cook breakfast. She handed me the apron without a word and smiled. In the months that followed, I learned how to live again. Not all at once, but in slow, deliberate pieces. I learned to knead dough and bake biscuits from scratch. I learned how to use a sewing machine, how to can peaches, how to make lavender oil. Henrietta taught me like a grandmother would, with patience and stories. And I soaked it all in like someone starving. But the nightmares didn't stop. At least twice a week, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the echoes of Calvin's voice still thick in my ears. I dreamed I was back in that bedroom, back in that house, back in my own skin as a scared little girl with no way out. One night, after a particularly bad dream, I wandered outside barefoot and sat on the steps. The moon was full, and the air smelled like mint and damp earth. Henrietta came out a few minutes later, wrapped in a shawl. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me. After a while, I whispered, "I think I'm broken." She looked at me for a long time and then said, "You're not broken, baby. You've been wounded. There's a difference. Broken things are tossed away. Wounded things, They heal if you let them. Her words settled into me like warm tea. I didn't believe her yet, but I wanted to. Eventually, I began writing. Just small things at first. Memories, feelings, lines of poetry. Henrietta gave me a journal with sunflowers on the cover. "Write it all down," she said. "Even the parts that hurt, especially those." So I did. I wrote about the house with thin walls, about the sound of Daddy's boots on the floorboards, about Calvin's smile and the way it twisted into something cruel. I wrote about Mama's silence, about the baby I never held, about the shame that clung to my skin like a second layer. And slowly my words began to pull me out of the darkness. When I turned 17, Reverend Avery offered me a chance to take the GED classes at his church. "You're smart," he said. "Always have been. Don't let what they did to you keep you from what you can be." I was scared, terrified even, but I agreed. Walking into that classroom for the first time felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. There were only a few other students. Older women, some veterans, a single dad trying to finish what he started years ago. They didn't stare at me. They just smiled. We were all carrying something, and I found comfort in that. My hands shook when I picked up the pencil. My voice trembled when I read aloud. But week after week, I returned. I studied. I learned. I even made a friend, Annalise, a mother of 3, who had left an abusive marriage and was rebuilding her life brick by brick. We'd study together in the evenings, sipping sweet tea and laughing more than I thought possible. She was the first person my age I ever told the truth to. Not all of it, but enough. She didn't recoil, didn't judge. She just reached across the table and held my hand. "You survived hell," she said. "Now you get to build heaven one day at a time." I passed my GED with high marks. Reverend Avery brought flowers. Henrietta baked a cake. I cried through the whole celebration. But with growth came new fears. What if Calvin found me? What if Daddy came looking? What if my past followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake? Henrietta sat me down one afternoon and said, "You're not that scared girl anymore, Evelyn. You have roots here. You have people who'd fight for you." It was true. I wasn't healed. Not fully. Not yet. But I wasn't that girl lying silent in the dark either. I started working part-time at the local library, organizing books and helping with children's reading hour. Being around kids made me ache in a way I couldn't explain, but it also gave me purpose. I'd watch them laugh and dream and run wild and free, and I'd think, this is what childhood should be. Sometimes I wondered about my own child, where he was, what name he'd been given, if he was happy. I didn't know if I'd ever get answers, but I knew this: I had survived. I had fought tooth and nail out of the hole they'd thrown me in, and I wasn't going back. One summer afternoon, as I walked through town, I passed a storefront with a small sign in the window, looking for volunteers. Women's shelter opening soon. I paused. Something stirred inside me. That night I told Henrietta I wanted to help. She smiled, proud as ever. "You're gonna change lives, baby, just by being you." And maybe I would. Maybe my story, as twisted and painful as it was, could be a light for someone else stumbling in the dark. Maybe surviving was only the first chapter, and living was just beginning. Volunteering at the women's shelter changed something in me. At first I thought I was just giving back, offering my time, folding blankets, handing out meals, reading to the kids while their mothers filled out forms or tried to get some rest. But what I didn't expect was how much I'd receive, how much those women, each carrying their own broken story, would pour back into me, drop by drop, until the emptiness inside me didn't feel quite so cavernous. The shelter wasn't much, just a 2-story brick building with peeling paint and a rickety porch that sagged in the middle. But inside, it was alive, safe, sacred. It was where women whispered the truth for the first time in years, where bruises were tended to, not questioned, where tears were welcomed instead of silenced. I hadn't grown up with spaces like that. I hadn't even imagined them, and now I was part of it. I mostly helped in the evenings after my shift at the library. I'd walk in, take a deep breath, and feel like I was stepping into a chapel, one without pews or stained glass, but holy all the same. Sometimes I'd help prepare dinner. Other times, I'd sit in the nursery rocking colicky babies while their mothers sat in group meetings or met with counselors. That's how I met Raina. She came in on a rainy night, drenched and barefoot, holding a toddler on her hip and dragging a trash bag filled with clothes behind her. She was maybe 20, maybe younger. Her lip was split and her left eye was swollen shut. But what hit me the hardest was the way she never looked up. Like even making eye contact would put her in danger. I brought her a towel and a cup of tea. She didn't speak for a long time, just sat in the kitchen, holding her baby girl against her chest like a shield. I didn't push. I just sat near her and peeled potatoes, humming softly to myself. After a while, she whispered, "He said if I left, he'd kill us both." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to choose the right words, not the ones people always say, but the ones I wished someone had said to me. "You were brave to walk out," I said, even when it felt impossible. She finally looked at me then, really looked, and in that moment something passed between us. Not pity, not charity, but recognition, one survivor to another. From that night on, Raina clung to me like a lifeline, and I let her. I'd hold her baby while she showered, sit beside her during support group, walk her through the process of getting a restraining order. I told her only small pieces of my story, enough for her to know I understood without making her carry my weight too. She once asked me, "Do you ever stop feeling like it's your fault?" I took a deep breath. Not every day, but most days. I know better now, and you will too. It was during that season that I found something I never thought I'd feel again. Purpose. Real purpose. Not just surviving, not just existing, but using what I had endured, what I had overcome, to hold someone else steady when the waves got too high. It felt like turning ashes into shelter, like spinning grief into thread, strong enough to stitch someone else's wounds. But even as I grew stronger, the past had its ways of creeping back in. One crisp autumn morning, I was restocking books at the library when the front door chimed. I looked up and froze. Calvin. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years, but there he was, standing in my safe space, older, thicker around the middle, still wearing that same crooked grin. I felt my knees buckle, and for a moment the world tilted sideways. He spotted me and smiled, like nothing had ever happened. "Evelyn May," he drawled, like we were at a family reunion. "Heard you were around these parts." I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry. My heart thundered so loud I thought the walls would rattle. My hands instinctively balled into fists at my sides. "What do you want?" I finally managed, my voice quieter than I intended. He laughed. "Just passing through. Thought I'd say hi to my baby sister." I wanted to scream, to run, to call the police, but I stood there paralyzed, 12 years old all over again. Our branch manager, Mr. Holloway, a kind man with thick glasses and a love for bird watching, walked in just then. "Everything all right, Evelyn?" I nodded quickly. "This man was just leaving." Calvin chuckled and tipped an imaginary hat. "Well, guess I'll be on my way then." As he walked past me, he leaned in close and whispered, "Nice place you got here. Be a shame if someone stirred things up." Then he was gone. I ran to the back and vomited in the staff restroom. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen, every light on, clutching a baseball bat I hadn't touched since middle school. I kept imagining him breaking in, finding me, finishing what he started. By morning, I was shaking so badly I couldn't pour a glass of water without spilling it. Henrietta found me curled up on the couch and didn't ask questions. She just wrapped me in a quilt and sat beside me until I stopped trembling. I told Reverend Avery what happened. He was livid. "He has no business here. You want to file a restraining order?" I nodded, but fear tightened around my throat like a noose. What if he doesn't care? What if this makes it worse? Reverend Avery looked me straight in the eye. "Then we don't let you fight alone. Not ever again." So we filed. It wasn't easy. The paperwork alone made my hands sweat. I had to relive it all. Every detail, every bruise. Every night I pretended not to exist, but I did it. For me, for that girl in Maple Hollow, for every Raina who came through the shelter doors, and the judge granted it. The moment I held the signed order in my hands, something shifted inside me. Not a victory exactly, but a reclaiming. A piece of my power returned. Calvin never came back. Maybe the order scared him. Maybe he finally realized I wasn't his victim anymore. Whatever the reason, I was grateful, but the shadow of him still lingered, curling around certain songs, smells, faces, and crowds. I knew I couldn't erase him, but I could drown him out with joy, with purpose, with light. Over the next year, I began speaking more publicly, at the shelter, at church, at small community gatherings, always carefully, always on my terms. I never gave too much, but I gave enough. I told the truth, not the whole truth, not yet, but enough to loosen the chains around my chest, enough to let other women know they weren't alone. At one event, after I finished speaking, an older woman approached me. Her name was Mrs. Bertha Lee, and she gripped my hand with surprising strength. "I'm 72, she said, eyes shining. "And I've never told a soul what my uncle did to me in that hayloft when I was 9. But hearing you talk tonight, it makes me think maybe I still can." We stood there, two grandmothers with scars hidden beneath their Sunday best, and cried together in a church basement. And I knew this was why I had survived, not just to live, but to free others. As the years passed, I saw girl after girl come through that shelter's doors, some pregnant, some covered in bruises, some holding babies with blank stares and shaking hands, each one with a story that mirrored pieces of mine. And every time, I knelt beside them and said, "You are not alone, you are not to blame, and you are not broken," because they needed to hear it. Because once, so did I. One spring afternoon, I got a letter, no return address, just my name in shaky cursive. I opened it and read the first line. "My name is Jacob. I think you might be my mother." The world stopped. I read the letter 3 times, hands trembling, heart hammering. He explained that he'd been told he was adopted, that he'd found papers with Henrietta's address after his adoptive parents passed away. He didn't ask for anything, just said he wanted to know if the story was true. I sat on the floor of my kitchen, letter in hand, and cried until I couldn't breathe. Then I picked up a pen and wrote back. The day I mailed that letter to Jacob, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly seal the envelope. I held it against my chest for a full minute before slipping it into the mailbox outside Henrietta's cottage. And then I waited. For days, every creak of the porch, every rustle of the mailman's footsteps made my breath catch in my throat. What do you say to a son you never held? What do you say to a child born of your own pain? I had no idea what to expect. I didn't even know if he'd write back. Maybe that one letter had been a moment of curiosity, a desire for closure. Maybe hearing from me would open wounds he wasn't ready to face. But a week later, another envelope arrived, this one carefully addressed in the same unsteady handwriting. I held it for hours before opening it. "Dear Evelyn," it began. Not Mom, not Mother, just Evelyn. And that was okay, more than okay. He told me about his life, his adoptive parents, Margaret and Henry, who had lived in Charleston and owned a small hardware store. He told me he'd always known he was adopted, but it was never a secret clouded in shame. They had loved him fiercely, raised him with kindness, and encouraged him to search for his roots when he was ready. He had 2 daughters of his own now, Emily and Harper, and a wife named Celeste, who taught music at the local high school. And then, at the very end of the letter, a single line made my heart stop. "I don't blame you. I just want to know you." I read that line over and over, tears slipping down my cheeks. That boy, my boy, had grown into a man with a gentle heart, and he wanted to know me. I wrote him back again, told him what I could. I didn't give him every detail of the past. Some truths are too heavy to lay bare at once. But I told him I was young, that I had no choice, that I loved him even though I never got to show it. I sent him a photo of me at 17, standing in Henrietta's garden with dirt on my hands and a faint smile on my face. Weeks passed. We exchanged more letters, then emails, then one day the phone rang. "Hi, Evelyn, it's Jacob." Hearing his voice for the first time felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. I didn't know what to say. We sat in silence for a moment. Then we both started talking at the same time and laughed nervously. His voice was warm, thoughtful. He didn't ask too much, just let me talk when I wanted to. He told me about his girls, about Celeste's love of jazz music, about how he had always wondered who he looked like. "You," he said quietly. "I look like you." That night, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror longer than usual. Tried to see him in the curve of my nose, the angle of my jaw. I didn't recognize myself, not really, but for the first time, I wanted to. 2 months later, we arranged to meet. He offered to come to Pine Haven. "Wherever you're most comfortable," he said. Henrietta made the house shine. She baked 3 kinds of pie and cleaned every surface twice. "Your son's coming home," she whispered as she placed a vase of fresh flowers on the table. "Whether he's lived here or not, this is part of him." I wore my best dress, the one with tiny blue flowers and a pearl button at the collar. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. When his car pulled up the driveway, I nearly fainted, and then he stepped out. Tall, dark hair flecked with gray, a cautious, kind smile on his face. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I whispered, and then he hugged me. No hesitation. no questions, just warmth and forgiveness, and something that felt like home. We sat on the porch for hours that afternoon. He asked about my life, my garden, my work at the shelter. I asked about his daughters, his job, his favorite food, macaroni and cheese, just like mine. There were silences, of course, but they weren't uncomfortable. They were sacred. At one point, I looked at him and said, I never thought this would be possible. He took my hand and said, me neither, but here we are. He stayed the weekend, brought Emily and Harper the next day. The girls ran through the yard barefoot, chasing Henrietta's cat and picking dandelions. Celeste hugged me like we'd known each other for years. You gave me my favorite person, she said. That night, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, Jacob walked in. I read your journal, he said softly. The one you mailed me last week. I didn't know. I turned, heart pounding. I'm sorry, I began. I didn't want to put that on you. He shook his head. Don't be. I needed to understand. And now I do. He paused. I don't see a victim, Evelyn. I see a survivor. I see strength. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight with tears. I want you in my life, he said. If you'll have me. It felt like someone had handed me the rest of my life back, piece by piece. From that moment on, we built something beautiful. Jacob called every Sunday, sent me photos of the girls at school, recitals, soccer games, birthday parties. At 68, I watched my granddaughters grow up through Polaroids and FaceTime calls. They called me Nana Evie. I knitted them scarves for Christmas and wrote them bedtime stories in letters. One summer, they all came to stay for a week. We picked blueberries and painted birdhouses. Harper helped me plant lavender. Emily asked endless questions about the olden days, and I told her everything, except the parts that weren't meant for children. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, shelling peas, Harper looked up at me and asked, Nana, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? I thought for a long time, and then I said, telling the truth, because it was. It still is. The past never stopped knocking. Some nights, the memories returned like waves crashing against the shore, but I wasn't drowning anymore. I had built a raft, and around me, a lighthouse stood. Jacob, Celeste, the girls, Henrietta, the women at the shelter, my garden, my words. One day I found a package on my doorstep. Inside was a small wooden box. No note, just a single folded newspaper clipping tucked inside the lid. Man found dead in apparent drunk driving crash. Calvin Whitaker, 59, of Maple Hollow. I sat very still. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Not relief, not joy, just stillness, like a chapter had closed. I walked outside, found a quiet spot beneath the maple tree in the yard, and buried the box. No prayers, no anger, just earth over memory. Afterward, I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink low, and whispered, I forgive you, not for you, but for me, because I was done carrying it. That winter, Henrietta passed away peacefully in her sleep. I found her curled beneath her quilt, hands folded, a smile on her face. She left everything to me, the house, the land, her books, her recipes. She also left a note. My sweet Evelyn, you turned pain into purpose. You made this old house a home. Now it's yours. Make it a haven like we always dreamed. And I did. I opened the doors wider, started a garden therapy group for survivors, built a tiny lending library by the road filled with books about healing, let the girls from the shelter stay weekends to rest, to cry, to write. Jacob came by more often, brought the family for holidays. We carved pumpkins and sang Christmas carols and celebrated every small victory like it was a miracle, because it was. My life didn't turn out how I imagined. It was darker, heavier, more twisted than any child should ever know. But it also became something rare, something holy. I once thought my story ended at 16, in a bedroom full of silence and shame. But it didn't. It began again and again, with every no I finally said, with every truth I spoke aloud, with every woman I held while she wept into my shoulder. And now, at 83, I sit here on this same porch, watching the wind dance through the trees, and I know I was never just what was done to me. I was always more. There's a quiet kind of joy that comes with old age, one that doesn't shout or sparkle, but wraps itself around your shoulders like a warm shawl. I never expected to make it this far. There were so many moments in my life where I was sure I wouldn't, where I believed the weight of what I'd endured would crush me before I reached 30, let alone 83. But here I am, still breathing, still standing, still telling my truth. After Henrietta passed, the silence inside the cottage was sharp, almost unbearable at first. Every corner of the house carried her fingerprints, her teacups, her quilts, the smell of lavender and rosemary that clung to the curtains. I missed her humming in the morning, the way she shuffled her feet when she walked, the way she always touched my shoulder when passing by, like a small reminder, I'm here, you're not alone. Grief settled in like a fog, thick and slow. I didn't cry much, not at first. Instead, I cleaned. I organized the pantry, replanted the window boxes, rearranged the furniture 3 times in 1 week. It was as if I was trying to find a new place in the house for my grief to sit, somewhere it wouldn't loom so loudly. One morning, while dusting the shelf above the fireplace, I found a small envelope tucked behind an old photo frame. Henrietta's handwriting, just 2 words, for later. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and a pressed magnolia flower. The note said, "Whatever you do, Evelyn May, keep the light on. There's always someone trying to find their way home." I sat down on the floor and cried harder than I had in years. It was the reminder I needed. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the shelter work with a kind of urgency I hadn't felt since I first arrived in Pine Haven. I helped expand our outreach, partnered with churches, recruited volunteers. I started a writing circle for survivors every Wednesday night in my living room. I called it The Unsaid. We'd sit in a circle with cups of tea and heavy hearts, sharing whatever we could. Sometimes just a word, sometimes a memory, sometimes only silence, and even that was sacred. It was enough. I watched women who had arrived shattered learn how to stitch themselves back together, thread by trembling thread. I watched them raise their children with gentleness, teach each other how to laugh again, how to rest, how to trust. And through it all, I learned how to forgive myself. That was the hardest part, honestly. I could look back now and understand that I was a child, that what happened to me was never my fault. But there were still moments, especially in the quiet just before sleep, when I'd feel that old guilt rise like a tide. Why didn't I scream louder? Why didn't I run sooner? Why did I let so much happen before I fought back? One night, I asked Reverend Avery that exact question. We were sitting on the porch, sharing warm cider and watching fireflies flicker in the tall grass. I did everything wrong, I told him. I was weak for too long. He looked at me with that same calm that had anchored me for years and said, "No, Evelyn, you did everything right. You survived, and you turned your survival into salvation for yourself and for others." His words didn't erase the pain, but they softened it. I began journaling again, more intentionally this time, not just for me, but for my family, for Jacob, for Emily and Harper, for the women who would come after me. I wrote down the parts I'd never said aloud, the parts I hadn't even let myself remember. I called the collection The Map Back to Me. One entry read, "I used to think healing was a destination, but it's not. It's a series of moments, some soft, some shattering, where you choose to believe that your story isn't over yet." Jacob asked if he could read my journal one day. I hesitated, then handed him the leather-bound notebook, hands trembling just like they did the day I first mailed him that letter. He read it over the course of a week. Then he came to the cottage, sat on the porch beside me and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he turned to me and whispered, "You're the bravest person I've ever known." I reached for his hand, and we sat there, silent, tears glistening in both our eyes. That same week, Harper, now 12 and bold as anything, asked if she could interview me for a school project titled Women Who Changed the World. I laughed and told her I hadn't changed the world. But she narrowed her eyes at me and said, "Well, you changed mine. That counts." So we sat at the kitchen table while she recorded our conversation on her little pink tablet. She asked questions that made me laugh and some that made me ache. "What's the scariest thing you've ever done? Letting someone love me after everything. What's the most important thing you've learned? That pain doesn't define us. What we do with it does." At the end, she asked if I had a message for girls her age. I looked at her, this firework of a child, full of questions and dreams, and said, "Your voice matters, baby. Use it, even if it trembles." She hugged me tight after that and whispered, "I love you, Nana Evie." And in that moment, I felt every broken piece inside me realign. Sometime later, I received an invitation from the local university to speak at a conference on trauma recovery. They had heard about my work at the shelter, my journals, the writing circle. At first I panicked. Me, a keynote speaker, but Henrietta's note echoed in my mind, "Keep the light on." So I said yes. The auditorium was filled with students, professors, therapists, survivors. I stood at the podium, heart pounding, voice shaking, and told my story. Not all of it, but enough. When I finished, there was a pause, then a standing ovation. But more than the applause, it was the line of young women who came to me afterward that moved me the most. One by one, they held my hands, whispered thank you, shared fragments of their own stories. One said, "You gave me permission to stop blaming myself." Another, "I thought I was the only one. I'm not anymore." In that room, I saw my younger self reflected back at me again and again, and I knew that even though the pain hadn't started with me, the healing could. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I stood by the window overlooking the campus quad. Students walked in pairs beneath lamplights, laughing, full of possibility, and I whispered to the wind, "Thank you for letting me live long enough to see this." The next morning, I received an email from a woman named Lillian, a therapist who had attended the conference. She wrote, "I work with young girls in group homes. Would you be willing to visit just to talk? Just to be seen?" I hesitated. My body was slower now. My bones ached more. But I remembered that promise I'd made to keep the light on. So I went. The girls were between 13 and 17. Some shy, some angry, all weary. I didn't give them a speech. I just told them the truth, that I knew what it felt like to be hurt, silenced, dismissed. One girl, maybe 15, with hair dyed bright blue, raised her hand and asked, "Did it ever get better? Like really better?" I smiled. Not all at once, but yes, in ways I never expected. She nodded slowly, eyes shining. That's all I needed to hear. Before I left, they gave me a handmade card. On the front, in glittery purple ink, it read, "Thank you for showing us what surviving looks like." I keep it on my nightstand. At 83, my steps are slower. I nap more often. I forget things now and then. But my heart has never been clearer. My voice has never been stronger. Every scar on my body, every tremble in my hands, every wrinkle around my eyes, they are proof, not of what was taken, but of what was rebuilt. I no longer measure my life in years lost, but in lives touched. And I know this. I was not born to be silent. I was born to rise. I used to think legacy was something only important people left behind. Politicians, artists, inventors, people with buildings named after them or books on library shelves. But now, sitting in my old rocking chair by the window of Henrietta's cottage, I understand the truth. Legacy isn't carved in marble or written in history books. It's found in the lives you've touched, the kindness you've given, the courage you've passed down, quietly, day by day. That's the legacy I've tried to build. It's been nearly 2 decades since I first opened my door to other survivors. What began with 2 women sipping tea on my porch has grown into something I never could have imagined. We call it the Lamp House now, a nickname the girls gave it because, in their words, it's where the light's always on. We didn't put up signs, we didn't ask questions. We just opened the door and said, "You're safe here. You're not alone anymore." At first it was just me, but over time a network grew. Volunteers came, counselors, social workers, retired teachers who had lived through their own quiet wars and wanted to help others survive theirs. We cooked meals, read stories, planted gardens, and sat up late into the night listening to stories that had waited far too long to be heard. Some women stayed for a weekend, others for months. A few never left, not physically at least. Even when they moved on, got jobs, rebuilt lives, their hearts stayed tethered to this place. They came back for birthdays, holidays, anniversaries of freedom. We'd light candles together each year for the ones who didn't make it out, who didn't live long enough to write a new ending. And we said their names, softly, so the world wouldn't forget. There were hard seasons too. Girls who ran back to what hurt them because it felt more familiar than kindness. Nights when I sat in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea, praying to a God I didn't always understand to please keep them safe. But there were also miracles. Like the day Reina, the first young woman I ever truly mentored, came back through my door, not as a guest, but as a counselor in training. She wore a name badge and brought her daughter, now 8, who ran straight into my arms yelling, "Miss Evelyn, I brought you a bracelet." It was made of beads and pipe cleaners, lopsided and perfect. Or the day we celebrated Callie, who once arrived too frightened to speak and now stood in front of a crowded room, delivering her testimony at a fundraiser. Her voice trembled at first, but then it rose, strong, unflinching. She said, "I thought the darkness would swallow me, but Miss Evelyn taught me how to carry a lantern." I wept that day, not out of sadness, but out of awe, because I had lived long enough to witness redemption unfold. Not just once, but over and over again. One spring, a young woman named Nina arrived with nothing but a backpack and a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. She was 19, covered in bruises, and refused to make eye contact for the first 2 weeks. I made her tea every morning. She never drank it, just let it sit there on the table while she stared out the window like someone waiting for a sign. One morning, I found a note beside the untouched cup. It read, "You don't have to keep trying. I'm not worth saving." I carried that note around in my apron pocket for days. Then I wrote her a reply on the back and slipped it under her door. My words were simple. You already are. That evening, she sat beside me in the garden for the first time. We didn't speak, just pulled weeds and watched the sun dip behind the hills. She stayed for 9 months, enrolled in night school, got a job at the corner store, applied for housing assistance. When she moved out, she left behind a drawing her baby had scribbled with crayons. Just colors and chaos, but she'd titled it, Nina's New Beginning. I framed it, because sometimes survival isn't loud or cinematic. Sometimes it's quiet, soft, ordinary, and still nothing short of sacred. Meanwhile, Jacob continued to weave himself more fully into my life. He visited often, sometimes with Celeste and the girls, sometimes alone. We'd sit on the porch or walk through the garden, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in silence. He asked more questions about my past, but always gently, always with care. One afternoon he said, "I know I missed so much, Mom." It caught me off guard. Mom. It was the first time he called me that. I smiled through sudden tears and whispered, "You're here now. That's all that matters." We started a tradition that fall, our own version of Thanksgiving, not on the holiday itself, but a weekend before, just for our family. We called it Gratitude Sunday. We'd invite the girls from the shelter, the volunteers, the therapists, the neighbors who had become our village. Everyone brought a dish and a story. Before we ate, we each shared something we were grateful for. One year I said, "I'm grateful for second chances, for finding my son again, for learning that healing doesn't erase the past, it redeems it." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Harper grew into a fierce young woman, outspoken and brilliant. She went on to study social work. Inspired, she said, by the work you and Nana do, Emily pursued music, just like her mother, and taught voice lessons to the little ones at the shelter. They both called me every week, sent postcards from college, asked for recipes and advice, and sometimes just comfort. I watched them become the kind of women I never got to be at their age. Safe, confident, loved. It healed parts of me I didn't even know were still broken. One evening, Jacob and I sat in the garden watching the fireflies blink to life. He turned to me and asked, "Have you ever thought about writing it all down? The whole story?" I hesitated. "I don't want to relive it," I said. "Some parts still hurt too much." He nodded. "Then write it for the parts that don't, for the parts that healed, for the ones who need to know it's possible." And so I began. Page by page, word by word, I stitched together the truth of my life. Not just the pain, but the beauty. Not just the loss, but the love that came after. I wrote for every girl who had ever sat on the edge of her bed and wondered if she was strong enough to keep going. And when I finished, I sent it to a small publisher that focused on survivor stories. I didn't expect much. But a year later, The Lamp House, a memoir of survival in light, was printed in paperback. The first time I held a copy in my hands, I thought of that girl in Maple Hollow, the one who cried into her pillow, who prayed for escape, who believed she would never be seen, never be heard, never be loved. I held the book tight and whispered, "You made it, baby girl. You made it." Since then, letters have poured in from across the country, from women in shelters, college dorms, prison cells, nursing homes. One read, "I'm 60 and just told my husband what my stepfather did to me when I was 11. Your story gave me the courage." Another, "I never thought healing was for people like me, but now I believe maybe it is." That's legacy, not a statue, not a plaque, but 1,000 hearts breathing a little easier because you dared to tell the truth. Now, in the stillness of this house that has held so many stories, I wake up each day with gratitude etched into my bones. I water the garden. I read to the children. I answer emails from women who just need to know someone's listening. Sometimes I light a candle in the windowsill at dusk, not because I'm expecting someone, but because I want anyone passing by to know you're not alone. There's still light. And on the days when my body aches a little more, when memory presses harder than usual, I remind myself I am more than what was done to me. I am what I chose to do with it. There are days now when I sit quietly by the kitchen window, watching the way light filters through the lace curtains and lands gently on the hardwood floor. It's a small everyday thing, but I've come to believe that healing hides in such ordinary moments. The way the sun warms your hands, the creak of an old chair, the sound of a neighbor's laughter drifting through the breeze. I don't take those things for granted anymore. At 83, life moves slower. My body doesn't do what it used to, and I no longer try to force it. I've learned to listen, to let the rhythm of the day carry me instead of fighting against it. But even in this gentle season of aging, there's still a spark in me, a sense of purpose that hasn't dimmed. If anything, it burns more fiercely now. Maybe because I know that my time here is no longer promised in decades, but in precious handfuls. One morning, while watering the geraniums on the porch, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find a young woman, barely 20, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, standing at the gate. She wore a borrowed jacket 2 sizes too big and clutched a plastic grocery bag with everything she owned. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I walked toward her slowly, careful not to frighten her. When I reached the steps, I said softly, "You found us." She nodded once, then broke down into tears. Her name was Jenna, and over the next few weeks, she told me her story, another heartbreak in a long line of women who had carried more than their fair share of pain. But Jenna had something else too, a fire, buried deep, nearly extinguished, but still burning. She reminded me of myself all those years ago. She stayed with us for 6 months, learned how to bake cornbread, took long walks around the pond, spoke in the writing circle for the first time, her voice trembling but her eyes bright with something I could only call defiance, not against us, but against the silence that had tried to swallow her whole. Before she left, she hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack. "You saved me," she whispered. I held her face in my hands and said, "No, sweetheart, you saved yourself. I just left the porch light on." That's what the lamp house has always been. A porch light, a symbol that someone is home, someone is waiting, someone sees you. Over the years, we've collected countless tokens from the women who've passed through our doors. A framed photo of a newborn whose mama was only 16 when she gave birth. A quilt stitched by a woman who spoke no English, but sang lullabies every night in her native tongue. A pair of ballet slippers, worn at the toes, left behind by a girl who finally got into the dance academy after years of being told she was too broken to try. Each item tells a story. Each story is part of a tapestry bigger than me. Sometimes I walk the halls of the house slowly, fingers brushing along the pictures, the notes, the drawings, and I whisper names into the quiet. Names of girls who stayed, names of those we lost, names of the ones still out there searching for safety. I pray for them even now. I also think a lot about Henrietta. She's been gone nearly 15 years, but her voice is still in this house. Her laugh in the creak of the stairs, her scent in the old Afghan she made for the couch. Every time I see a new girl sitting with her hands clenched, unsure if she'll ever be safe again, I think of how Henrietta touched my shoulder all those years ago and simply said, "I know," and I think of Mama. It took me decades to separate my grief from my anger, and even longer to accept that Mama did the best she could with the tools she had. She was broken in ways I couldn't understand then, but I do now. She was raised in a time when silence was expected, when obedience meant survival. She wasn't equipped to protect me, but I believe she loved me, even in her failures, even in her blindness. That's not an excuse, but it's a truth I've made peace with. I visit her grave now and then. I bring flowers. I tell her about Jacob, about Harper and Emily, about the women at the house. I imagine her listening, maybe even proud. And Calvin, his name still stings. Not because I hate him, but because of what he stole from me, from so many. I no longer dream about him. He's faded into the background of my memory, like a shadow that no longer scares me when the lights go out. I used to wonder what justice would look like, if his suffering would ever match the pain he caused. But I've learned that sometimes the truest justice is in what we build in the aftermath. I may never have seen him held accountable in this world, but I've seen the faces of 100 women who now know they are more than what was done to them. That, to me, is justice enough. Some nights, when sleep won't come, I sit on the porch wrapped in Henrietta's shawl and listen to the crickets sing, and I talk to God. Not in the way I used to, begging for answers, demanding reasons, but in quiet gratitude. I thank him for letting me survive. I thank him for letting me become more than my past. And I thank him for every soul that's crossed my path and taught me something new about grace. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from a former resident named Ariel. She's in her 30s now, married, 2 children, working as a trauma counselor. She wrote, I tell my clients about you, Miss Evelyn, about the woman who wore soft sweaters and made tea and looked people in the eyes like their pain mattered. You taught me that healing is possible, not perfect, but possible. I read that letter 3 times, then tucked it into the top drawer of my nightstand with the others, my treasure chest. Jacob framed the first page of my memoir and hung it above the fireplace. It reads, This is not a story about what broke me. It's a story about what I chose to build after the breaking. I look at that line often, because even now in this season of softness, I am still building, still hoping, still offering what I can. Sometimes a cup of tea, sometimes a warm quilt, sometimes just an open door and a listening heart, and always, always a light in the window, because someone, somewhere, is walking through darkness, and maybe, just maybe, they'll see this light and remember, home isn't always where you started. Sometimes it's where someone made room for you. I used to think there would come a moment when the pain would simply vanish, like steam off a kettle once the fire was out. That one morning I'd wake up and my bones wouldn't remember, that there'd be a clear line before and after darkness and light. But life isn't made of clean breaks. It's a tapestry full of threads knotted with sorrow, hope, memory, and forgiveness, all woven tightly together. And now, in the quiet chapters of my life, I see that healing was never about forgetting. It was about learning how to carry it without letting it carry me. Last winter was hard. My joints ached more than usual, and I found myself short of breath after just a short walk through the garden. The doctor said it was just age. You're doing beautifully for 83, she said, patting my hand. I smiled, but that night, alone in bed, I cried. Not because of fear, but because my body was beginning to whisper that its time here was not forever, and there were still so many things I wanted to do. Letters I hadn't written, stories I hadn't told, hands I hadn't held. But what calmed me wasn't denial, it was remembrance. I thought of the faces of the women who had walked through my door. I remembered how they arrived, eyes hollow, voices barely more than whispers, and I remembered how they left. Stronger, steadier, sometimes even laughing. That was God's work, no doubt. But he let me hold the lantern. Harper came to visit during the first snow. She brought peppermint tea and a new scarf she'd knitted herself. You taught me, she reminded me, back when I was 6. You sat me on your lap and said every knot is just part of the design. We drank tea in silence, watching snowflakes drift like feathers beyond the window. Then she asked me, do you regret anything? I didn't answer right away. I thought of my childhood, the screams I kept behind my teeth, the bruises I wore like shame. I thought of Mama and all the words we never said. I thought of the baby I lost, the silence I endured, the decades spent hiding from mirrors. And yet, I regret the years I didn't believe I was worthy of joy, I finally said. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret choosing love, even when it terrified me. And I don't regret becoming the woman I needed when I was 10. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, you became her for all of us. That night, I dreamed of my younger self. She was sitting by a creek, knees drawn to her chest, hugging herself tight. I sat beside her. We didn't speak. I just put my arm around her and let her lean into me. When I woke up, tears had soaked my pillow, but I wasn't sad. I was finally whole. In March, the Lamp House celebrated its 25th anniversary. I never thought I'd see that day. We hosted a small gathering, just the core women, the old friends, the ones who had helped me carry this mission forward. Jacob stood beside me during the speech. He placed a gentle hand on my back as I looked out at the faces. Faces I'd once only known as pain, now transformed by strength. I didn't build this alone, I said. I just opened the first door. You built the rest. Then one by one, they came forward. Women I hadn't seen in years, some gray-haired, others with toddlers in their arms. They told stories I'd forgotten, laughed at memories I didn't know they'd carried with them. One woman, Roxanne, said, you gave me my first journal and told me to write like no one was reading. That journal became the novel I published last year. Another, Shayla, handed me a photograph, her graduation from medical school. You're the reason I believed I could do more than survive, she said. You're the reason I became a healer. I held that picture for a long time. Then I tucked it into my purse and told her, that's going on my fridge. After the celebration, I sat alone for a while in the kitchen. The house had gone quiet again. The candles flickered. The smell of roasted vegetables and warm bread still lingered. And for the first time, I allowed myself to say it out loud. I'm proud of my life. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because I took the broken pieces and made something beautiful, because I never let what they did define what I could become. Not long after that, I began preparing something I'd put off for years, a series of letters, each one addressed to the women who meant the most to me. Some were meant to be read after I'm gone. Others, I've started handing out now. To Jacob, I wrote about grace, about the redemption of our bond, and the strength it took for him to come back after so many years. You gave me the gift of forgiveness, I wrote, and in doing so, you taught me how to forgive myself. To Harper, I wrote about voice. Never silence your truth to make others comfortable, I told her. You were born to break cycles. To Emily, I wrote about art. Sing like it's prayer, teach like it's salvation. Music is how we remember what words forget. To the lamp house itself, I wrote a final blessing. This home has held pain, yes, but more than that, it has held resurrection. Let every board and beam remember our laughter. Let the walls echo with the names of the women who found shelter here. May it stand long after I am gone, a lighthouse for the lost. Some afternoons, I walked the garden with a cane in one hand and my old straw hat on my head. I nod to the roses. I whisper to the bees. I run my fingers through the lavender like it's a hymn. And sometimes I stop by the oak tree where Henrietta and I first spoke. There's a bench there now, carved with the words, "You are safe, you are seen, you are home." Every now and then, someone new arrives. The world, after all, still turns. Just last week, a teenage girl named Maya knocked on the door. She didn't say much, just, "They said you help people." I smiled and opened the screen door wide. "We try," I said. "We really try." She's here now, sleeping in the back bedroom with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I check on her every night. I don't know her full story yet, but I know the look in her eyes. I've seen it before, and I know what to say when she's ready. I believe you, and you are not alone, because that's all any of us ever wanted, isn't it? To be believed, to be held without condition, to be seen in our entirety, wounded, brave, flawed, radiant, and still be called worthy. That is what I leave behind. That is what I hope the world remembers. Not the girl who was hurt, not the silence I carried, but the woman who survived, who chose to love louder than her pain, who left a light burning in the window for you. I used to wonder what the final chapter of a life like mine would look like. Would it end quietly, a whisper lost in the wind? Would it be marked by some great event, a final act of redemption, or a reunion long delayed? But now, living it day by day, I see that there is no grand curtain fall, no fireworks, just peace, just presence, just the long exhale of a soul that has known both agony and grace. I wake now to bird song and the soft clinking of dishes downstairs. Usually Harper or Emily helping with breakfast for the house. Some mornings I join them and crack jokes about how I still make the best biscuits, arthritis and all. Other mornings I sit by the window and let the light remind me that I'm still here, still breathing, still needed. I no longer rush, I no longer chase. I have become a witness to my own becoming and to the sacred unfolding of others. People often ask me how I found the strength to tell my story, to stand in the light after so many years hiding in the shadows. And I tell them, it wasn't courage, not at first. It was survival. It was breath after breath. It was choosing moment by moment not to let my pain become my identity. But eventually, survival gave way to purpose, and that purpose gave way to joy. Because once you stop apologizing for your existence, once you stop shrinking to fit the comfort of others, you begin to bloom in ways you never imagined. I am not a prophet. I am not a hero. I am a woman who lived through hell and made a garden out of ash. And if that makes me anything, it makes me free. Free from the lies they told me. Free from the shame they buried me under. Free from the silence I once mistook for strength. And in that freedom, I've discovered the kind of love that doesn't ask for proof or penance. The kind that simply says, you matter, you are sacred, you are enough. My grandchildren call often now. Jacob visits every Sunday without fail. He brings a slice of cherry pie from the diner and sits on the porch swing while I tell him stories he's heard 100 times. He laughs anyway. He always laughs. Last week, he brought his daughter, Lila, for the first time. She's 8. Bright eyes, loud giggle, messy hair. She climbed into my lap like she'd always belonged there and asked, "Grandma Evelyn, were you ever scared?" I looked into her small, unburdened face and answered honestly, yes, almost every day. But I learned that being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you keep going anyway. She nodded like she understood, then asked if she could have a cookie. That's how legacy works, I think. Not in the dramatic declarations, but in the ordinary moments where our truths become tools for someone else's strength. I've written down my story now, all of it. The pages fill 4 leather-bound journals, some of them stained with tears, some with coffee. They're kept in a wooden box beneath my bed, and when the time comes, they'll belong to the lamp house. Maybe someone new will read them. Maybe she'll find her own reflection in my words. Maybe she'll feel a little less alone, and maybe she'll decide to write her own story. Not the one others forced on her, but the one she chooses, chapter by chapter. That's the miracle of healing. It doesn't end with you. It multiplies. It echoes. It creates ripple after ripple of freedom. I don't know how many days I have left. I don't spend time counting anymore. Each one is a gift, and that's enough. I no longer fear the end. I've known darkness, and I've known the one who carried me through it. I imagine when that moment comes, I'll be on the porch, warm blanket on my lap, tea in hand, and the wind will shift just enough to let me know it's time. I'll close my eyes, and I'll whisper a thank you so full it'll shake the heavens. Thank you for the pain. It taught me to feel. Thank you for the silence. It taught me to listen. Thank you for the betrayal. It led me to truth. Thank you for the journey. It made me who I am. And to every woman who hears this, wherever you are, whatever pain you carry, you are not alone. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose next. You are every prayer whispered in the dark, every sunrise after a storm, every song that rises from brokenness into beauty. You are worthy of rest, worthy of softness, worthy of you. So if this story touched you, if something inside you stirred while listening, don't keep it in. Let it rise. Speak it, write it, sing it, dance it. Let the world see the fire in you. And if you can, leave a light in your own window, because someone out there is looking for it. Someone out there needs to know that healing is possible, that love is still real, that even after everything, you're still here. And if you made it to the end of this story, I invite you to comment down below. I arrived at the end because I believe in healing. Click like, share this story with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real, raw, and redemptive journeys like Evelyn's. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. This video is an original work inspired by true stories of survival and resilience.